So we're going to have a look at that passage just there. And as Becky mentioned, this is part of a series we've called 2020 Vision, where we're just sort of stepping back a little bit and looking at the sort of big picture issues. So next week, we're going to be thinking about looking backwards in our lives and thinking about the question, can I leave the past behind? You know, there are things in my life wish weren't there, that I regret and so on. How can I leave the past behind? Is that possible? And then the week after that, we'll be thinking about life in the here and now. How do I find God, connect with God in the busyness of life? That's the next few weeks. But today we're thinking about our lives in terms of looking forward and thinking, does God have a plan for me, a purpose for me in life? And apparently each month, 250,000 Americans tap into Google the question, what is the meaning of life? And I tapped that question into Google this morning, and I got back 2,620,000 search results in 0.61 seconds. Google boasted. It's amazing, isn't it? And then just a glance, I must say, I haven't done my research thoroughly. I didn't go through all those responses, but I did look at the first couple of pages. And it's a whole mixed bag of things. What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? There was a quote from Monty Python's film, The Meaning of Life. It goes like this: well, it's nothing very special, life. You just got to try to be nice to people. So you need to avoid eating fat, read a good book every now and then, and get some walking in, and try to live together in peace and harmony with everybody from every nation. Okay, so that's Monty Python's take on the basic core purpose and meaning of life. Lots of stuff's unsurprising that people say. What's the meaning of life? To seek wisdom, to be good, to love God and others, to be happy. So there's quite a lot of religious suggestions, as well as people with the exact opposite end of the spectrum. So Richard Dawkins flicks up, and it says that he sees the universe as having precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design and no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in life. And in that vein, Ingmar Bergman once said, "You were born without purpose. You live without meaning. Living is its own meaning. And when you die, you are extinguished. From being, you will be transformed to non-being." Okay, it's a rather bleak view of the purpose of life, isn't it? So I thought we would just look at this passage in the gospel that we've just had read to us, where the gospels are full of these little encounters, where someone encounters Jesus, and it's an incredibly important moment in their lives. And that's what's happening here with Peter, who came the disciple Peter. He was called Simon to start with, and Jesus gives him the nickname Peter, and both those names are used in this passage just here. And we find at the end of the passage that he finds a new purpose in life, and he's following Jesus, and there's a new sense of an energy and a new beginning for Peter at the end of this passage. But before he gets there, it wasn't a straightforward path to get there and find it. In some ways, it was quite painful for him. Before that new sense of purpose comes a new sense of nearness and a new sense of clarity. So I want us just to sort of go with Peter on his journey just here, this new nearness, this new clarity, which led to a new sense of purpose in his life. So let's just have a look at those things in Peter's life and see how he came to that realization that God had a purpose. He was significant in God's plans. First of all, then, a new nearness. Peter experienced in this passage a new nearness to God. Now, what do I mean by putting it like that? I don't mean there was a physical nearness to Jesus. Peter had been physically near to Jesus for a while now. In fact, we know Peter had even had Jesus over to his house, and Jesus had healed Peter's mother-in-law. So he'd had plenty of time to get to know Jesus. He'd heard what Jesus had to say. He'd seen the kind of things that Jesus could do. He'd had the chance to see what Jesus was like. He'd been around Jesus, physically near Jesus for a while now. And there's a parallel sense in which that can be true today, for us today. You can grow up in a Christian home. Someone you know really well, maybe, someone you know intimately, might be a Christian. You know something of the Bible. Maybe you've been to Sunday groups as a child, or teenage youth groups and so on. Church was or is a regular part of life. So Christian things, Christianity, Jesus, not entirely new, not new to you at all. Like Peter, if you're familiar with Jesus, positive about Jesus maybe, physically near, as it were, to Jesus. And yet, despite all that, Peter discovered that there's a kind of nearness to Jesus that he hadn't experienced yet. And maybe you haven't either. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. And I'm going to try and help us to see what that kind of nearness is. Help us to see what it is so that we can know whether or not we still need to experience what Peter came to experience in this account just here. And on this occasion, there was a crowd there, eager to hear what Jesus had to say. And obviously there was no sound system like we've got today, so they're pushing forward to hear better, because they can't all hear very well, so they're pushing forward and it's crowding Jesus out. So he spots a couple of boats. Jesus spots a couple of boats on the shoreline, and he gets into one of them, and he speaks to the crowd from the boat just offshore. And the boat belongs to Peter, to Simon Peter. And you can't help but get the impression that for all Peter's physical nearness to Jesus, he's not quite as engaged as he might be. I don't know, you just get that impression, I think. People are crowding round to hear Jesus, and Peter is there too. He's there, but he's cleaning his nets. He's doing the sort of first century equivalent of flicking through his phone, do you see? And, you know, he's listening, maybe he's half listening. And apparently, Jesus spotted this, and he thought to himself, right, Peter, this is going to be your day. I'm coming for you. Look at verse 4. When he had finished speaking to the crowd, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Now, just as a quick aside, this is a passage about a miracle, and I know that, how can you live in our society and not know that lots of people find the idea of miracles hard to swallow? And yet these stories in the Gospels, they don't read like legends. They don't read like myths, like things from the mists of time that may or may not have happened and probably didn't happen. They don't read like that. In fact, there's all sorts of reasons why we feel compelled to treat the Gospels as historical, the historical eyewitness accounts that they claim to be. There's all these, for example, incidental little details that you get mentioned. Fishermen washing their nets. The fact that there were two boats there on the shoreline. You get little details like that all the time. You don't get that kind of thing in myths, in legends. Why are they included? They're just markers that it's an eyewitness account. They're included because those details were observed and were there. And because they're eyewitness accounts, sometimes some of the details that we get about the lead characters of these stories in the Gospels, people like Peter, are often very embarrassing. So if you were making up a story, writing a book, making it up in order to kind of launch the Christian faith, to give it credibility in some way, and you're making it up, it's hard to understand why you would include lots of the things that they did include in the Gospels about the leaders of the first church, which Peter was due to come. Lots of embarrassing details that you'd rather bury, probably, if you were trying to make it up to persuade. Why did they include them? They included them because they were being honest. They really happened. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of us. This is just the beginning of Peter's relationship with Jesus. All that stuff's down the line. Just here, Jesus turns to him. He says to him, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." And Peter says, in effect, "Now, why would we do that, Jesus? Everyone knows that if you want to catch fish, you've got to get them at night. And we've been up all night, and we haven't caught a shrimp. Okay? But because you say so," and in my mind's eye, he's rolling his eyes slightly as he says, "Because you say so," okay? And verse 6 says they'd let the nets down. And when they did, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So what it is, it's a story of a miracle, a miraculous catch of fish. But here's the thing. This kind of miracle is actually very unusual for Jesus to do. When Jesus performs a miracle normally, he normally does it because there's some kind of acute need, some desperate need that needs meeting. Jesus' miracles, so that they're normally acts of compassion to help someone who really, really needs help. But that's not what's going on here, is it? Peter's not really in desperate need. All that's happened is he's had a disappointing night's fishing. You could hardly call it, an emergency case or anything like that. So what's Jesus doing? What Jesus is doing is that he's getting nearer to Peter, to who Peter really is himself. See, when Peter had Jesus in his house and Peter saw Jesus heal his mother-in-law and heal all those other people, Peter could say to himself, isn't that amazing? Isn't that wonderful? I could do with some of that in my life. It's not my area of expertise, but I could use some of that in my life. It's just great to have Jesus around. And he could kind of admire Jesus, but from a distance, in a way that didn't really interfere with Peter's own life. But what's Jesus doing now? Jesus is interfering in Peter's own area of expertise, isn't he? He's getting involved in the area of Peter's life in which Peter thinks he knows best. It's as if he's saying to Peter, "Peter, I know you've heard what I've got to say. I've seen you've been listening or half listening. I know that you've seen what I can do. Okay? But I also know that you're holding me at arm's length. You've seen it all, you've heard it all, but you've not let me get near to you." It's as if he's saying to Peter, "Peter, I want to be involved in the very center of your life." If I can put it like this, this is the moment that Peter seems to move from being a Christian with a little c to being a real Christian. That moment when it dawns on him that Jesus wants him to let him into his life. Jesus wants to tell this fisherman how to catch fish. He wants to tell the teacher how to teach. He wants to tell the doctor how to practice medicine. He wants to tell the soldier how to serve. He wants to tell the friend how to be friendly. He wants to tell the mother or father how to be a parent. He wants to tell the retired person how to use their time. He wants to tell the vicar how to minister. He wants to tell the husband how to love his wife. He wants to tell the fisherman how to fish. He wants to be involved at that very point of our lives where we think we know best and where it would be, frankly, just easier if we could keep him at arm's length. He wants to be nearer. And Peter says, "Okay, if you say so, okay." And he lets down the nets. And as he does so, he moves into a new relationship with Jesus where he's really beginning to take Jesus seriously now. He's moved nearer. He's letting Jesus interfere at the point at which he thinks he knows best, at the very heart of his life. And as that happens, here's the second thing. As that happens, there is a new clarity in Peter's life about himself and about God and Jesus, okay? So he moves nearer, he becomes clearer. That's what happens as we go on in spiritual things with God, with Jesus. As we move nearer to him, other things crystallize and become clearer. Okay, let's pick the story up. Peter says, okay, he says, I let the nets down, and then he does that, and pandemonium breaks out at that moment in this story. Suddenly, the nets start filling and pulling, dangerously pulling, and the boats are rocking, and water starts coming in over the gunnels, if gunnels really are a thing in boats, I've no idea, but water's coming in, okay. Frantic calls to James and John to launch the other boat. Launch the other boat. If the boat sinks, the business sinks, but if we get this catch back to land, we're not going to need to work until Christmas again, okay. And at some point in the middle of all that action and busyness and pandemonium, there was a significant moment between Peter and Jesus, a moment of clarity when Peter realized who he was standing face to face with. Look at verse 8. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. Now, I guess this was a miracle for fishermen, wasn't it? Okay, and when they see this, they are thinking to themselves, what just happened here? And they know that what just happened here was impossible. What just happened here never happens. But it just happened. And Peter reacts the way everyone in the Bible reacts. The moment they realize they are standing in the presence of someone extraordinary, not just someone great, but standing in the presence of God. He reacts like that. He's suddenly dawned on him, as we were singing, who is this man? And when people do that in the Bible, they see in a new way God's overwhelming greatness. This has dawned on him. Who is this? And they see in a new way their own sinfulness, their own inadequacy. That's happening to Peter here. There's a new clarity. Do you know that sort of feeling? That moment the lights come on about something, and it's that lights on moment actually that causes your heart to sink. So, for example, maybe you remember that moment when you were first falling in love with someone, and you want to invite them round. And with that thought, you look round at your room or your flat, and you thought to yourself, oh, I can't invite them here. And up until now, it's looked fine, and you've been perfectly happy with it, but the pile of clothes and the underpants over here that you've been ignoring, do you know what I mean? They were all right till now, but suddenly you think, oh dear. And then you look over at the sink and the dishes, and it's all grubby, and there's a moment of clarity. You think, I couldn't have them round here. And Peter's having just that kind of heart sink moment, but it's not about his room or his house or anything like that. It's about his heart. And friends, that is far, far more significant than where we live. And Peter says, I can't have him here. I can't. And so he says, go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. It's a moment of clarity. And he's absolutely right. Honestly, as well, you yourself, me, would you think your Creator, your God, would you think Jesus would be happy with the state of your life and your heart? Is it all the way he would want it to be? I don't think any of us could say, come in, Lord, I think you'll find everything to your liking. Would you say that? I don't think I would say that. I don't think you would say that, would you? I don't think we would. Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. That is clarity. And then Jesus says something just wonderful to him. He says to him, but Peter, don't be afraid. That's a very curious and striking thing to say. Why does he say that? Privacy is a big thing these days, isn't it? It's a huge thing. And actually, we've always valued our privacy as human beings, haven't we? I heard an interview on the radio this week, and an older interviewer, was interviewing a younger musician. And he was saying, how do you cope with the lack of privacy, with the whole social media intrusion right into life and everything? And the younger musician, he said, it is an issue, but he says, he more or less said, what you older guys don't get is that my generation has grown up with that, and we're just used to putting our lives online. Well, now that's true, isn't it? That would be true of some of us here. But the version of ourselves that we put online isn't usually the whole version, is it? Or even the true version. And that's true of all of us, whether we're online or not. The public version of you and me, that you and me and everyone else sees, isn't the whole you and me, is it? The full and unedited you and me. One of my daughters for Christmas asked for a secret diary, the sort of diary that has a little lock and a key on it. Why do we put locks on diaries? You know why we put locks on diaries, don't you? We would hate for someone to be able to read the innermost me. I mean, mind you, she's 6. I mean, how bad can it be? She's only 6. But I wouldn't want you to be able to see that. Would you? Well, what's the word I would use for that thought that you might know me in that way? The word I would use is I would be afraid. I'd be afraid for you afraid because when you see it, you wouldn't think of me in the same way again. You'd reject me. You'd know what I was like through and through. Isn't that why we're afraid to let people get near to us? And Peter has just let Jesus get nearer to him, and suddenly he realizes what that means, and immediately he wants to push him away, and so he says, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." And Jesus says, No, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. In other words, I do know you, and I'm not going to reject or despise you. I've read the diary. I know everything about you, and I still want you. So we've been reading a book to our children called Treasures in the Snow, which is by a lady called Patricia St. John, or Patricia St. John. And she wrote some if you've not discovered them, they are really lovely stories, books, but they often have penetrating spiritual moments in them, which I find just really, really helpful. And Treasures in the Snow is a story that's set in the Alps in Switzerland, and the main character is a young girl called Annette. And she has a younger brother who gets injured in a terrible accident. And the reason the accident happened is because of something a boy in Annette's class did, called Lucien. And because of this accident, Annette hates Lucien. And perhaps the very heart of the story comes at the moment where Annette is, one evening, she's sitting with her grandmother in the house in Switzerland. And she asks her grandmother, she says, "Grandmother, if you hated someone, you couldn't ask Jesus to come into your life, could you? If you hate someone," the grandmother says, "it just shows how badly you need to ask him to come in. The darker the room, the more it needs the light." "But I couldn't stop hating Lucien," says Annette, softly. "No," says grandmother. "You're quite right. None of us can stop ourselves thinking wrong thoughts, and it isn't much good trying. But Annette, when you come down in the morning and find this room dark and the shutters all closed, do you say to yourself, 'I must chase away the darkness and the shadows first, and then I'll open the shutters and let in the sun'? Do you waste time trying to get rid of the dark, Annette?" "Of course not," says Annette. "Then how do you get rid of the dark?" "Well, I pull back the shutters, of course, and then the light comes in." But what happens to the dark, Annette? I don't know. It just goes when the light comes in. Well, that's just what happens when you ask the Lord Jesus to come in, says her grandmother. He is love. And when love comes in, hatred and selfishness and unkindness will give way to it, just as the darkness gives way when you let in the sunshine. But to try to chase it out alone would be like trying to chase the shadows out of a dark room. It would be a waste of time. So do you see, the very reason Jesus has come is to chase away the dark. Don't say, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Say, "I am a sinful man or woman, therefore, please come in. That's just why I need you." So when Peter has this moment of clarity, I am a sinner, and Jesus is God, and so I don't want anything to do with him. Jesus says, don't be afraid. He says, that is why you need me. That is why I'm here. And from that moment on, Peter realizes he has found a new purpose in life. As he gets nearer to Jesus, he gets clearer about Jesus, and that leads to this new sense of purpose. Look what it says in verse 11. It says, so they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. They left everything. What did they leave? What did they leave on the beach that day? It says they left everything. What does that mean? It means they left the biggest pile of fish they'd ever seen in their lives. In other words, the biggest pile of money that they'd ever seen in their lives. Why did they leave something so valuable behind them? Because they'd found something more valuable. We always want the more valuable thing. And Jesus had become more valuable to Peter now than that had before. Why? Because when you find someone who knows you through and through, someone who's read the diary, and they still say, and I want you, and I'm going to help you, and there is forgiveness here, and I can change you from the inside out. That, when you found that, don't let go of that. Peter knows that, and he's found it. And he says, that's what I want. He's what I want. My life now is all about Jesus. He found a new sense of purpose. Followed him. And some of us have been doing that for years, for many, many years. And it's just a good thing, again and again, to come back and say, yes, following Jesus, that's what I'm still about. When I read a thing like this, I go, yes, Lord. That's why I love you, because I know you love me, despite what I'm like. And I want to change, but thank you that you love me. And the thing particularly, he says to Peter, is from now on you will fish for men. In other words, you will introduce others to me. You will want to share with others what you have found yourself in me. And those of us that are following Christ, we need to. We want to recommit ourselves to that and say, Lord, yes, I want to be part of spreading the light and life of Jesus. And for others of us, that following thing is if I'm honest, I'm at the keeping him at arm's length stage. Maybe I know a bit about him, maybe not much, but I know it's not up near yet. But I can see what he's saying, and I can see what you mean about that clarity of what I'm like on the inside and what God would be like. But these things, it's all a bit fuzzy for me still. Don't let it rest there. Please don't let it rest there. Take a step forward. Becky mentioned those faith courses, Thursdays or Tuesday evenings at the end of January. Fill in the next steps card, the red card. Let us know you're interested. If you're interested in a kind of, I don't know if I'm interested, can you tell me a bit more about it kind of way? Sure, me or Becky will fill you in, and then you can decide whether it's the right thing for you. Or whether you just want to chat to someone a bit more about these things. We're here to help. That's what we're all about. Get nearer, you get clearer. You get clearer. You see Jesus' grace and love. And there's that new sense of purpose. Let's pray together. Let's pray.